Hi there, this is Mike Radcliffe talking about my PowerPoint presentation, which will be on World War II, the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. Well, before we begin, though, we should learn a little bit about what Nazis are. Now, Nazis stands for National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazi Party was formed in 1919, 2 years after the end of World War I. Now, how did they become so powerful? Well, a big reason why they became so powerful in the first place was because after World War I, the German government was in total chaos. They had to pay back millions and millions of dollars in reparations to the countries that they fought against during World War I as a result of them losing the war, and they had their armies reduced to really, really small numbers. Now, the Nazi Party was formed in 1919, but they were slowly gaining power throughout the years because of a turbulent government. And when everyone thinks of Nazis, it all comes down to Adolf Hitler. Now, Adolf Hitler was actually born in Austria, not Germany. And what happened in his background was we all know about his life as trying to get into an art school and being rejected. Then he had his times when he became a political activist for the Nazis in the late 20s and beginning of the 1930s. This led to his imprisonment, and while he was in jail, he wrote a book that many people know is Mein Kampf, which was a book about his ideology towards people that he deemed to be not of the Aryan race or superior race, which would be anybody with any sort of illness, disease, any kind of birth defects, anybody that was not 100% German for 3 to 4 generations at least, blonde hair, blue eyes, muscular, all these things. Anyone who he deemed not to be that, he came up with a quote-unquote final solution for them. And that final solution was the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust, as many people know, was the deliberate extermination of people that Adolf Hitler had a problem with who did not fit his master race philosophy. So, he began to round up Jewish people, gypsies, disabled people, mentally handicapped people, anybody that did not fit his Aryan race. He tried to round up across Europe and put them into death camps, such as Auschwitz, which are more or less known as concentration camps. And one of the famous examples is Kristallnacht, which was the Night of Broken Glass. Now, Kristallnacht was a night in the late 30s when the Nazi Party came in and destroyed this town in Poland or towns in Poland and Germany, and took out all the Jewish people that they could find and started sending them to these death camps that had already been established. And they called it the Night of Broken Glass because shop fronts, stores, all these things, their glass was broken so that the Nazis could get in and grab the people inside. And one of the famous examples of the Holocaust and what people would do to avoid it was the story of Anne Frank. We all know about the Diary of Anne Frank, and her story was that her and her family lived in the attic of some random strangers they knew for almost 3 years, hiding from the Nazis because they were Jewish. Unfortunately, they were found and they were captured, and then eventually her and her family ended up dying in these concentration camps. But she wrote a diary about her life and living up in this small attic for almost 3 years. And many people read it today to just get a personal view of how life was during the Holocaust. Now, beginning in the road to war, we have to look at the Treaty of Versailles, which was set up in 1917 when Germany was forced to pay back reparations to the countries that fought Germany in World War I, which would be France, England, the United States, and this nearly bankrupts the country. They have no money to begin with, and now they have to pay all this money back to other countries. It really cripples them. And people in Germany obviously are not going to really enjoy this, so they have a lot of really bad feelings They don't like outsiders. They feel as though they've been treated bad. They feel as though the leadership led them down the wrong way, and now that their country's facing inflation like they've never known because of the bad decisions of a few people. Well, eventually, Hitler gains power and gains control of the government in Germany in the late 30s. So on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. This is the beginning of the war in Europe. And then we have the fighting in Africa. So what Germany and Italy did at this point is they were moving into Africa from June 10th, 1940 to May 16th, 1943. Now, there was fighting all over Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, all over northern Africa. And what would happen is that the U.S. in the later months, probably towards 1943, England, Australia, Canada, all were fighting the Germans in Africa. And Germany, Italy, and Vichy French were the Axis powers. Now, Vichy French are the French people that decided to actually side with the Nazis in figuring that it was better to serve with the Nazis than to have France occupied. So after almost three long years of fighting and really just bloody bad warfare in Africa, the Allies finally win and force Germany and Italy to retreat from northern Africa up north through Italy and move back into Europe where the fighting will be contained. Now, on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor happens, and now that was when a naval base out in Hawaii was suddenly attacked in the morning by a fleet of Japanese aircraft or air fighters. They bombed ships when we had no idea what was going on and caused lots of destruction, and it was a horrible, horrible event. Almost 3,000 American soldiers died on that day. Now, this caused the United States to enter the war about a day or two later. And the war in the Pacific is a very important time in which the United States learns how to really fight a two-front war, in that on May 7th and 8th, 1942, they have the Battle of the Coral Sea with the United States Navy versus the Japanese Navy. Now, the Japanese Navy had been doing really well for all this time, just blowing over the United States. Well, in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the United States is able to match Japan, but later on in the war, at the Battle of Midway, the U.S. finally defeats Japan and causes Japan to start to retreat. Now, key figures in the war are, for the United States side, we have General George Patton, a 3- and 4-star general, depending on the time, led most of the campaign in Europe. Then we have General Douglas MacArthur, who led much of the campaign in the Pacific. Then we have Dwight Eisenhower, who would later become president, as the commander of the entire army in Europe. And we also have FDR, who was the president at this time. For Germany, we have Adolf Hitler. Everyone knows Adolf Hitler. But we also have his general, his second in command, is Rommel, known as the Desert Fox. He leads much of the campaign in Africa, and after Africa's defeat, doesn't last much longer in Europe. For Russia, we have Stalin, great Joseph Stalin, the political leader. Then in England, we also have Winston Churchill, the famous orator and leader of England. Then we also have General Montgomery, who works a lot with General Patton and General Eisenhower during the European campaign. To begin the European campaign, we have D-Day, which was June 6, 1944. That was an invasion of Normandy, France, by the Allied troops. Over 160,000 Allied troops landed on June 6th, and on that day, over 9,000 were lost. One of the worst days in U.S. forces history. And actually, one of the funniest things about Normandy was the reason why it worked is because they had a diversion invasion at the Pas de Calais, which is where, for weeks and months, fake troops and tanks were set up so that way the Germans who were spying over there in planes thought that there was a real army camp there, and what they did was they were saying that the invasion would come from here, and not from Normandy, so in this way it diverted a lot of the resources by the Germans. Now, the war in Europe isn't going as well for Germany in the later years because they're fighting a two-front war, which is they're fighting the United States and England on the west of Germany and Russia in the east. And one of the biggest mistakes by the Germans is to invade Russia, the Soviet Union, in June of 1942. And they're marching towards Stalingrad and Moscow, the biggest cities of Russia. Unfortunately, they don't get there very fast, so they have to deal with the winter. And Russian winters are extremely, extremely bad in that the cold can get up to minus 40, minus 50 degrees. They have to deal with snow, which slows down the German army almost completely. They have little resources, and they're losing men daily, which leads us to the Battle of Stalingrad, in which becomes a long siege that the Russians are able to hold out until the winter, where they know how to fight and how to deal with the winter, and the Germans do not. And the Germans, almost as soon as the winter hits, realize that they can't do this. They can only fight in the spring and the summer and the warmer months, so this forces them to retreat out of Russia. Now, the march towards Berlin. We have the Battle of the Bulge, which was from December 16, 1944 to January 28, 1945. It was a desperate counterattack by Germany. They had pretty much no move left to make, and the only way they thought they could really win this war is to do a desperate measure like this. And unfortunately, it turned out to be a pretty bad decision because they had huge losses by Germany. The United States, because of this, ends up getting within 70 miles of Berlin, Germany. And the Soviets, on the other side, actually do get into Berlin and fight for a little over a month in Berlin, causing the German army to surrender. On May 1st, 1945, Hitler decides that he can't win the war, and he realizes that he will not stand any sort of trial or anything like that, so he commits suicide. And a week later, Germany and what's left of its leadership formally surrenders. This is known across the world as VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day. However, the war still rages in the Pacific. Now, in 1942, the U.S. begins fighting Japan at battles like the Battle of Midway, in which the famous Admiral Nimitz was the leader and commander. Now, one of the main strategies of fighting in the Pacific was the theory of island hopping, in which the Navy would send in people like the Seabees, and that's what my grandpa was a Seabee, which is construction battalion. They would send them into islands that the United States controlled and build airfields, airstrips, build bases, so that way the planes wouldn't have very far to go to attack Japanese islands and destroy their ships. And one of the famous battles of the Pacific was the Battle of Iwo Jima, which was February 19th, 1945 to March 26, 1945. Very small island, very large casualties for the United States, for both sides actually. 26,000 Americans died, 22,000 Japanese died. More Americans died, but the larger percentage was Japanese, and 22,000 Japanese died. That was almost every single Japanese person on that island. Less than 100 prisoners of war were taken. To really end the war, the United States decided to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. They then dropped a second bomb 3 days later at Nagasaki. Each bomb that was dropped contained 22 kilotons of TNT. Now, that's an enormous amount of TNT, which led to the casualties of 150,000 roughly at Hiroshima and 75,000 at Nagasaki. This leads to the end of the war and Victory in Japan Day, which was August 10th, 1945. Japan finally formally surrenders. Now, the United States and Russia, or at the time Soviet Union, end up emerging as superpowers. However, this leads to the dawn of the atomic age and the arms races and the beginnings of the Cold War, which will not end nicely for anyone, not through necessarily fighting, but through drawn-out conflicts and tension. And that is my PowerPoint presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.